Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the State of Influencer Marketing webcast. We're thrilled that you've taken some time out of your day to listen in. I'm Todd Cameron, the head of content at Tap Influence, and we've got a great session for you. Momentarily, Brian Solis of Altimeter is going to walk us through his recent study, the Influencer Marketing Manifesto, followed by Clint Bagley from Current PR, who's going to show us how to apply those learnings to real situations with a few case studies. But first, a few housekeeping items. If you have a question, please use the questions windows. We'll be answering those at the end of the webcast. There's also a link to the PDF of the presentation that's available in the Links and Attachments window. And the on-demand recording of this will be available shortly after we finish today. So if you can't make it through the whole thing, you'll be able to come back and finish it later. And obviously, please follow along on social. The most active participant today is going to receive some Tap Influence swag, so make sure you get out there. And we're using the hashtag #GetHeard. So without further delay, I'd like to introduce our featured speaker, Brian Solis. Brian is Principal Analyst at Altimeter Group, a profit company, where he studies the effects of disruptive technology on business and society. He's got a very special ability to humanize all of these incredible trends to help us see how technology and people are changing and what we do about it. He's an award-winning author and an avid keynote speaker who's globally recognized as one of the most prominent thought leaders in digital transformation, innovation, and experience. Brian's authored several best-selling books, and his latest book, X, explores the intersection of where business meets design to create engaging and meaningful customer experiences. So, Brian, welcome.
Hey, thank you, and thank you to everybody being part of this, and also I want to say thank you in advance to Clint, who just reminded me that we first worked together 8 years ago, and I guess we're not getting any younger. But on that note, digital influence has been something that I have tracked actually since the early 90s, and it is something that I'm very, very passionate about. And when Tap Influence came along and offered the ability to do some research together, I was more than willing to jump back into the mix, because I think that, even though when I first started conducting this research and definitely experimenting with digital influence, I might have been a bit early in the mix. In fact, today and even over the years to come, influencer marketing is going to become more prominent than we could all imagine. And another reason why I was inspired to do this research with Tap Influence is because what lies ahead is actually the more formalization, the more modernization of a formal program. Today, I think we're experimenting quite a bit. I think that a lot of us are still fighting the good fight to get justification or validation for this work. I know that budgets aren't necessarily something that are just falling from the trees. But the point of this research was to help you make the case, and also to show you not only where you are, but also where you could be. Because what I also noticed with digital influence is that it's still vague in terms of what it means to the audience, to the market, to executives, and even to influencers, right? I mean, in some way, shape, or form, we are all becoming influential in our own way. But I also wanted to help us together design a more, not just lucrative, but effective form of relationship building, because at the end of the day, that's what this is. And I know you're all eager to get to PowerPoint slides, because who isn't, right? But before we get there, one of the reasons I'm so passionate about digital influence is because I believe that social media and social networking is sort of this great state of technology that allows us to be more human again, that allows us to build relationships that weren't possible before, that allows us to create and share and learn in ways that just weren't possible before. And that means that we can't just use these as channels, meaning people and their networks as channels to broadcast our stuff. These are human networks. These are powerful opportunities to humanize your brand, your message, your story. But to do that, we have to start with relationships. The basic, just take digital out of the equation, of what makes a relationship special, what makes a community special, and how do we add value when we go into each engagement. So without further ado, I wanted to share, before we get into the greater conversation about influencer marketing, sort of the state of, right? Because it was the state of that translated into what we hoped would become this manifesto for digital influence and relationship building. And to do that, that means that we can't just see people by the numbers. I mean, I have been fortunate enough over the last, I don't know how many years, too many, as Clint reminded me, to earn an audience and across several networks. So not only do I study this stuff, I mean, I'm on the receiving end every single day of offers to be part of some influencer program. And I got to tell you, it's disheartening at how very little I'm presented with even an introduction of, hey, I follow your work, or this or that, or nothing of that. Just basically a acknowledgement that I have an audience and therefore I should want to do something with this particular company. And I think if we were able to look at influence from a human perspective, to see people and their relationships and the nature of that engagement for what it is, we might actually have the opportunity to create not only a stronger influencer marketing campaign, but also have a stronger platform for which to show executives and our peers and our colleagues what this is capable of doing. So in our research, we found that marketers have a perspective of influence marketing, right? But you also have to talk to the influencers that show that they have their own take on this too. And it's amazing how many or how few people actually do that. So let's kind of jump into the research and see what it tells us. So we asked marketers, and then we looked at influencers and asked them similar questions as well, so that we could sort of create, find the alignment, and also where there were gaps. And if you look at the first question, is why do you feel influencer marketing is important? And we ranked that, so number 1 was the most important, and 5 was the least important. And when you look at the first one, which is basically in the 2s, it is more authentic storytelling for our brand. Okay, that's fantastic because brands haven't necessarily been the most authentic in the past. That's just because of the nature of creative and marketing and advertising. It's one of the reasons why ad blocking is a thing. So if we look at, though, way down the line, bordering on the least important aspect of the range, to make our brand feel more plugged into digital communities. I was very surprised that wasn't higher. So then that leads me to believe, well, what does authentic storytelling mean? Does that mean that we're actually trying to be human and not only plugged into digital communities, but be part of these digital communities? Because I was surprised at the discrepancy between those. And of course, the research is available for you to download, and you can geek out over this following the presentation, but I want to set up the stage for the greater discussion here down the line. There's a great article that was published by somebody on the advertising side that said, you are not a storyteller. But it is a word that we're using quite a bit, and authentic, by the way, too. I mean, ever since social media became a thing, authentic and transparent were the 2 biggest buzzwords. But now storytelling is added to the mix. I don't know that we actually understand what it means if we are not willing to be part of a community, if we're not willing to be relatable to a community. Storytelling starts with listening before you start telling people that story. And so I think if we look forward, then from the influencer side, what is it on your side that your audience loves about your work, right? And in this case, it was just because they were authentic, right? So here, authentic takes a different type of definition. It's more human. It's personality. It's demeanor. I am myself honest, funny, open, and willing to call it like I see it. Right, but then the next bit is that, and this was, I thought, very important, that I provide value by addressing the things they are interested in. And then the third most important was that I interact with them, listen, and respond online. So on one side, you have more authentic storytelling, whereas I'd argue that both authentic and storytelling are maybe the types of things that are driven more by the people within your organization that approve it, right? So, and as well as legal, because legal always has to have a say, rather than being part of a digital community. And I think it's a massive discrepancy that influential marketing tends to start off on the wrong foot. Then if you look what's next here, you have what types of influencers do you find to be most successful? And this was asked of marketers. Well, the number one is, a popular person with a significant and desirable audience. Again, so if you're not thinking about what's authentic, if you're not thinking about what digital communities you want to be part of and what makes those communities thrive, if you're just trying to find people who have a big audience, right? Because that's popularity, you can define it any number of ways, but it trumps those who are subject matter experts regardless of following counts. And it's just a reality. It's long been a reality with marketing, is that we look to scale our story as great and as wide and as sweeping as possible. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's okay. So looking at the state of what is, it gives us an opportunity to see what the future can hold. Right? So now the reality is, if we're not looking at what makes digital communities tick, if we're not looking at actually what makes a brand connectable to different types of audiences, if we're not really looking at the people who build relationships with their communities for very specific reasons, one being that I want to listen and I want to add value to my own communities, then that makes the challenges for influencer marketing or the future of influencer marketing greater. So, for example, the biggest one is finding relevant influencers. Well, of course, Tap Influence and other companies out there will help you figure that out. But once you find the right people, you have to figure out, first, what constitutes the right people? And then what constitutes delivering value to their communities that help them engage in meaningful experiences, right? But the number two challenge was meeting or satisfying executive expectations. Obviously, in all of marketing, not just influencer marketing, there's a massive disconnect between what executives expect, what money buys, and when we're talking about human beings on the other side of this, we have to understand what it takes to then to build a bridge between how these influencers define value and meaningful engagement and also executive expectations. And they're sometimes so far out of whack because most executives do not live their brand or their markets the way that their customers or influencers do. And so it's our job to sort of build those bridges. If we look at what other challenges influencer marketing faces within the organization, it's just very clear. I mean, look at all of these. I grouped them all together. It's an unproven channel. And as a result, there's no budget. As a result, if it's an unproven channel or there's very little research into how, what makes these communities tick and how do we add value to it, then there's no real way to make the case for it across the organization, right? It's bigger than PR, it's bigger than marketing, it's bigger than digital, social, you name it. It's something that is actually has the potential to impact every aspect of the organization. If you look at every study, especially Edelman's Trust Barometer, every single year, it continually reminds us that people do not trust executives. People do not trust brands. They trust people like them. And this is why influencer marketing becomes so important. In fact, the term itself, influencer marketing, is sort of misleading or a misnomer in that what we're really talking about is just building communities of people where we add value to these communities because we understand what it takes. But one of the other challenges, and this was fourth on the list, but notably higher than anything else, behind it, was the lack of control over messaging. And again, this is where I think a lot of marketers make mistakes, is we try to keep influencers on message. I can tell you as a quote-unquote influencer, I've been given everything from brand style guides to scripts to all kinds of things that are just the opposite of authentic and, quite honest, borderline ignorant in terms of what it takes for me to keep my value with my community, right? I don't want to lose followers or any face with the people who have taken the time to follow me and my work. So then if we talk to the influencers, what are some of the biggest mistakes brands and agencies make in working with you? This one, I have to laugh because it's also one of the biggest gripes that influencer marketers have, in that they don't have budget, so therefore they can't pay influencers, and influencers expect to be paid. So it was the highest element on their list. And a lot of marketers say, well, we don't understand. If we have a good story to tell, why wouldn't you want to be part of that story? Why wouldn't you want to be aligned with our brand? It's got to help you gain clout, not with a K, but with a C, clout in your market, which is completely, it's just not right. It's people have plenty of things to do, plenty of things to say, where they don't need to just work for free for a brand. It's not even fair. It's not even realistic. But the other challenge that they have is, again, matching up with the last bit, is overly restrictive content guidelines. It's honestly quite unbelievable to what extent brands try to control what influencers say. But they're put on message. They're given content or parameters of which to adhere to, and then they're also given timelines and calendars. They require an X amount of social shares for each post. They require that influencers have to send drafts of their posts so that they could be reviewed by the team to make sure it's on message. This all sounds very inauthentic to me, right? So if we're talking about authentic storytelling, this entire list, aside from adequate compensation, tells us that we're actually not practicing what we preach. It's like if you participated in a focus group and someone asks you, do you exercise? Do you exercise 3 to 5 times a week? You're going to say yes, because you don't want them to know that you don't exercise 3 to 5 times a week. I think that this is just one of those things where we have to hold up a mirror and say, how do we let go where just the collaboration and co-creation of our brand becomes part of the community based on how the community defines value? I actually believe that those who blaze the trail for influencer marketing are going to be the ones that actually are the champions for not just the influencer, right? Let's just take the influencer out of it. There are human beings behind that influencer that follow them for a reason, and it's different for each influencer. I think you are the steward, or you are the champion of those communities, and you bring that back and you reverse engineer how to create the right types of programs that are engaging, that are inspiring. So kind of moving forward, and we look at what are the most effective forms of influencer marketing. Well, we have ambassadorships, right? So I remember, it's got to be 12 years ago, I was part of the Intel Insiders, and it was an ongoing ambassadorship of where we were given early access into the plans of what Intel was working on and what that meant to the industry. We were given early access to events, technologies, et cetera, and we were just welcome to share our interpretation and reaction to them. So it was run separately than a traditional PR program, but it also felt very inclusive in that we were made to feel special in ways that access can give you, and that meant for a productive experience. But there are other ways too that can help. Reviews, brand mentions are how marketers define it, but I would tell you that influencers would have a different perspective. But event coverage, sponsored content, etc. On the influencer side, though, sponsored content is the way that brands typically want to engage with their audiences, right? So that's basically more like advertising than it is relationship marketing or engagement. And I think that again shows us that we're not really authentic storytellers. We're just trying to push our message through people, not doing it in new ways, but just old ways. So that, I think, is, to me, humbling, right? Because I know that you're all going to go back and you're all going to look at just pushing your influencer strategies through the pipeline and dealing with the frustration and challenges that you have. But we're not going to improve the future of influencer marketing if we cannot actually find a way to do what we're saying, which is authentic storytelling and adding value to the community. And if we can't do that, we're not really going to be able to win over executives, or we're not going to be able to build awareness within the organization of the value of influencer marketing, and that's going to result in these budgets being extremely low. I mean, most of these budgets for an influencer marketing campaign is between $0 and $5,000, with a notable part in the top 4 with free product in lieu of money. And if you look at the influencer perspective on this, it is under $500. It is, but again, in the top 3, free product in lieu of money. So I don't know where you fall into this, but it's just more reflective of just the nascency of influencer marketing. And considering that I wrote my first series of influence papers back in the early 2000s, it hasn't come a long way since then. Of course, that's going to change, and that's why we're all together, is because we're looking for ways to improve our influence and improve our work. I'll just share quickly here. When we look at what marketers view as the top platforms, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, and blogs, knock out the top 5. In the influencers that participated in our survey, their blog was their home base, and their blog could be anything from a very high-end site or what have you, something represented through management. But that was number 1, and then Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. I got to tell you though that in its own way, it's hard to look at these platforms because in a hierarchical function, because then we tend to say, all right, well that according to Brian, influencers mean that we have to reintroduce blogger relations programs, and then Facebook should be second in terms of our prioritization. It's not really how I would interpret this slide. If anything, once you start to find the people who are important to you, you have to look at then what platforms sort of become the most important based on those people. And then each platform requires its own sort of cultural form of engagement, right? Because how you would engage somebody in blogs versus Facebook versus Instagram are all very different forms of authentic storytelling. And that's it's very user-defined. That's why a lot of this is just good old-fashioned relationship marketing. There's no real scale to the execution of it. There is scale and automation into how you find these influencers and how you prioritize them. So if we look at what inspired influencers to become influencers, I was and wasn't surprised to see that earning revenue was at the top of the list. But I was pleasantly surprised or just happily reinforced to see that the second biggest reason was to make an impact or affect change. Following that is building an audience or to grow popularity, and of course behind that is becoming a thought leader or an expert. So it is what it is, right? So we have to understand what drives someone and then build the right type of program that reinforces their ambition and their personal goals. They're not there just to push your brand. And even though they want to earn revenue, they can't do it at the cost of their social capital within these networks. It has to be done in ways that actually boost their credibility and position within that community. So just simply passing a message isn't effective enough. Now, just kind of moving ahead, and clearly that people value cash, but I guarantee you that aside from that, the biggest, greatest value is value, right? My position within my own community. Of course, you can't do much of this without the FCC paying attention, but I am surprised at how very little brands and agencies ask their influencers to at least provide disclosure. It's a tricky space, but you have to, because it's also a form of credibility. It's counterintuitive in that regard, but it is. When we ask marketers how do they manage influencers, the most interesting response was that brands tend to work directly with influencers or the managers of influencers. So, for example, if you've ever worked with YouTubers, they all have managers. They all have representation. At least the more popular ones do. And on the lower end of the scale, the agencies come into the mix. If you look at on the influencer side, it's basically the same thing. It's brand direct, but then after that, it is through PR agency. And then after that, I thought was very interesting. A big percentage of them are engaged through an influencer marketing platform. So as a personal aside, I could tell you that I get more requests through influencer platforms than I do personal requests. It's just fascinating in how impersonal this whole idea of influencer marketing has become, and I think that's up to us to change. And remember, as we're going, and before Clint comes on, if you have questions, just pop them into the questions tab there, and we'll make sure we get to as many as we can. So moving right along, and then I'm going to just sort of accelerate this so that I can give Clint some airtime. Looking forward to his slides as well. If we look at how you measure success, this is also part of the problem. I mean, a lot of marketers are using vanity metrics, so engagement, posts, likes, shares, which is why a lot of them require so many shares in any type of influencer engagement, because that to them boosts their numbers. But even going down the list, when you're close to 3, you're beyond. 1 is the most important, 5 is the least important, right? So I think what we start to see is the need to. I work a lot with Google, and Google believes that we have to invest more in growth metrics. And so if you look at what growth means, it's like I want to move the needle. I got to measure some type of meaningful, tangible outcome that executives will appreciate, so that way I can get more budget, get more support, get more resources for my influencer marketing program. And that comes down to metrics. That comes down to what you tell executives happened as a result of influence. And if you look at how influencers are measuring their own success, it's with traffic, it's with shares, and hopefully re-engagement from brand or additional assignments, so that you like them and you like working with them, so you come back. So moving to the second part of this, if you look at ROI, where we have to first define what return is. Like, what do you want out of this program? If the answer is I want a lot of shares or I want a lot of impressions, it makes it difficult to go back to executives who may or may not appreciate that. But I think about just the textbook definition of influence, just not even digital influence. I look at influence means the ability to cause effect or change behavior. And so I kind of think about that. Well, what kind of effect do we want to have? What kind of value do we want to deliver? What kind of mutual benefits do we want to have for both the influencer and the brand that executives will be able to appreciate? And I think if we don't start to look at the mechanics of relationships, and if we don't start to think about the value that each community values and how we create content, how we create engagement programs that deliver against that value, then we're always going to be stuck to these vanity metrics. Influencer marketing is just going to become a new tool that's used in old ways, and it's something that we shouldn't really think about scaling. How do we resonate with an influencer's audience? How does the audience feel that they got value from that influencer's engagement with you? Because that's ultimately what this is about. And relationships and value are very human. This is why social, public relations, marketing, all of these disciplines have the ability to start over in an era where relationships are scaled through technology, not the other way around. And that starts with a different type of checklist that we need to create. Several years ago, I wrote this report, of which I highly, highly recommend that you read in addition to this latest research. It'll put everything into perspective. And it is a free download. But the reason why I want to bring that back up again is because it reminds us what influence is and what influence is not. Right? I think there was a statement in that report that I still see every day shared across multiple networks, which is influence is not the same thing as popularity. Or, and it's, even though some people define influence as being popularity, well, it's defined by many things. If you look at the definition of influence, right, the capacity to have effect or change behavior, that sets the stage for what influence is not. It's not the act of trying to influence or trying to manipulate. I think there was there's I think that I once said that there are only two ways to influence communities. One is to inspire, and the other is to manipulate. And this is about people. This is about changing the nature or the dynamics of how your company talks to people. So we have to take a step back and realize that there's only so much money and time we have. There are limitless ways to use that money and time in order to reach your markets and reach people. But the value has to look at the ultimate experience that communities have with these engagements. And you have to see them in its human form. This is a map I drew many, many years ago showing that based on the way that I talked, that there were about 5 different types of communities that defined my ultimate audience. And this changes and evolves over time, especially as I change topics. But they were sort of comprised of the social graph, which are personal relationships, the interest graph, which are the networks that I have of people who share similar interests, and those are, as you can see, are divided, and also behaviors, so depending on the network. But this is important to understand because social networks are formed by relationships tied to interests, aspirations, commonalities, and if we just look at the number, then we assume everyone follows someone for the same reason, which is not true. And so when you're finding the right influencers, you have to see to what extent and why they are influential and what it is about the community makeup that defines where you can add value to each subset of that. Because what we're really talking about is the exchange of social capital, right, where interactions become a form of currency. I spend and I earn social capital. The reason why people build those communities is because they earn a form of trust and reciprocity, right? It's the pillars of a relationship. And if you build upon that, then you can use what I called the 3 R's, or the pillars of influence, which was some combination of these 3 things would define your different types of influencer programs. There was reach, there was resonance, right? The ability to say something and have it reverberate, to what level and to what extent, of course. And then building upon relevance. How do you establish trust? How do you deliver value? How do you define that this brand should be, or this company or this product should be relevant to any given community? And then I showed how these things play out, how the expenditure of social capital can work with your brand so that you could heighten these influencer marketing campaigns. Because once these things cross through in a relevant way, in ways that resonate, and ways that reach the right people in the right ways, going through the interest graph and the social graph, you now have an effect that you can measure, right? There's a state before and there's a state after. And trying to deliver value comes to life in very human ways. I think it was Robert Cialdini who wrote The Pillars of Social Commerce, and he applied that to sort of a digital era, but showed that if you start to make these things more human, you find ways to actually have or carry meaningful influence in the markets, whether it's social proof, authority, scarcity, which is now probably aligned with FOMO, how people sort of like what other people like, the consistency in terms of your authority, your position within a community, reciprocity, which I think is probably one of the strongest forms of social engagement, which means that you earn so much value within your community that the community gives back to you. And so if you think about the brand as an influencer, right, so you becoming part of the influencer network, then the reciprocity that the communities that either follow your influencers or follow your brand, the way that reciprocity is formed is in trust, in relationships, in hopefully spending or great word of mouth. And so I think now that we start to become more aware of the potential of our possibilities, then ROI now has to start to mean the realization of influence as well as the return on investment. So we got to know what the return is so that we can then realize our capacity to influence. And that means that things like vanity metrics are not influence. Those are just sort of KPIs that maybe get you closer to your goal. And we have to remember that keeping influencers on message and having them send us drafts and having us approve what it is that they're going to say so that our executives or our legal team will sign off on it, that doesn't constitute value. That's broadcast, that's spam, that's all the stuff that people tune out. And we're part of the problem if we're not trying to find ways to be relevant. And actually, that's what social is about, right? It's the shift from monologue to dialogue, and we have to use influencer marketing from a dialogue perspective. Because if you think about it, on the ultimate consumer side, so just even the people who follow influencers, they do so because they get value from that engagement. It's a trusted source, it's a meaningful source, it's a consistent source. And when we don't deliver that against those expectations, people tune out, right? This is exactly why people just are really focused on their algorithms, why people are very focused on curating their own networks, because 63% of consumers will defect from a brand due to irrelevant content. 41% would consider fully ending a brand relationship, and 22% already have. That is ours to fix. It's a problem we caused, but it's a problem we can fix. And if you go back to that statement about inspiring or manipulating behavior, keeping influencers on message is not inspiring engagement in any way, shape, or form. You're just using human beings as digital commercials or digital billboards. I think that there are different types of influencers using different types of platforms, but what consistently makes them matter is that they make an impact in their own way, and that's what defines community. So your market is comprised by a multitude of communities, not one big audience of people who follow a lot of influencers. And that means the work is, of course, harder. Yes, you have to spend more time identifying the right people. You have to understand, or you have to spend more time creating the types of campaigns and strategies that are relevant to each one of those communities. You have to spend time investing in the type of content or having influencers collaborate or co-create in the types of content that are going to be meaningful to those audiences. This is hands down across the board, and I wish these stories were told more, that the most effective forms of influencer marketing are oftentimes where the influencer is in control of how that message is told. There's just certain parameters or pillars, but that's what defines the art of engagement. And I think if you think about the R in the ROI and then the I in the realization of influence, we have to now start to think about, well, what are the actions, what are the reactions, and sometimes what are the transactions that we hope to see in this engagement. That means that we have to think about the end in mind, as Stephen Covey once said. What is that we want to do? How is it that we want to inspire markets and inspire engagement and build communities around, the quote-unquote authentic storytelling or the value that we want to bring to the table? Because I think that it is user-defined. It's not brand-defined. We reverse engineer this. And I think this makes your work not only more effective, but more important in what you do moving forward. It's harder. It's more expensive. I understand that there are challenges to get through, but there are challenges without doing this as well. And this is the very thing that starts to solve for making influencer marketing of bona fide and, pun intended, an influential form of marketing within the organization, but also a more influential form of marketing, an effective form of marketing in the markets that you're trying to impact. Because at the end of the day, the network is more powerful than the node. This is what Hugh had designed. Hugh McLeod, a friend of mine who's an artist. We used to talk about the idea of the human network, and that the idea of the human network was powered by a human algorithm, which was people sharing with people ideas, content, insights that made that community stronger. So I'm going to turn it over to Clint now, but I just wanted to say thank you for your time and attention, and I'll stick around for the Q&A at the end.
Awesome. Thanks, Brian. I could listen to you talk all day. Super helpful stuff. So I wanted to move on a little bit and talk about some of the day-to-day things that we recognize as we've been doing this. Current is part of IPG. We're a sister company of Weber Shandwick, so our core sort of competency lies in PR, but we've noticed throughout the years as we've been pitching bloggers as traditional media that, they have been really moving into this paid space. Any blogger out there or what you would fall under the influencer umbrella that's worth their salt realizes their value. And so that's something we're all sort of having to figure out and deal with. And it's a lot of work, real honestly, to do this correctly. I think people see some of the horror stories out there where there's a celebrity that will do a cut and paste of a tweet or something that really doesn't add a lot of value and sort of comes off as the new version of the banner ad. And we really think that storytelling is the most important thing. Again, it's what we do on a day-to-day basis as a PR practice, and trying to really control the message, which would be more on the advertising side. Those two things really don't jive to each other, and we feel like having sort of the PR background gives us a really good leg up to work with influencers the way that we need them to work, and the way that they need us and brands to work. It's really about our people. We're the ones that sit in a room and try to figure out what the PR-based common trends and things that are interesting to people in the real world would be interesting for influencers to put their own sort of spin and story on it. It's really important for us to sort of get their buy-off and their agreement. They do, at the end of the day, have to report to their audience, and if they're non-authentic, and I know that's the most overused word in the world, but if they're going to be the first ones that get called on it by the people that follow them, and so they really do have to stay true to sort of the type of content that they write about. So through these compelling stories and relationships, and really figuring out which influencers out there are the best, sort of the best for a specific program, and every program is absolutely unique and one of a kind. That's where, we really sort of see the value come in and move away from, just traditional advertising into something that's very useful, as Brian mentioned. We use TAP. It's one of the few different platforms and tools that we use depending on what we need. And what that's really done is it helps us move away from the really tedious, difficult parts of contract negotiation and things of that really pull us off of that authentic storytelling and that strategy. By automating a bunch of that stuff, it really lets us sort of focus on the story, which is important. We've done more than 100 programs on behalf of a wide variety of brands. We've paid out over $1 million to influencers direct. We're very fortunate to work on 11 of the Clorox brands. They are an awesome client partner because they really push us into thinking of unique ways to do things. And a lot of the reason that we are so heavily invested in influencer as a practice, and why I came on, is because of the expectations and the openness of our partners at Clorox. So I'm going to talk a teeny bit about process here. We'll jump into a case study, and I definitely want to leave time for Q&A because I think that's where it really gets interesting. Our process, if there's anyone on the phone that's a PR person, this really mirrors the same way that we would formulate a really smart media strategy. That part hasn't changed. We need to determine the objectives and goals up front. Having a really thoughtful, creative brief that talks about all the things that are important to the brand. And keep in mind, this is not a scripting exercise. This is here are some puzzle pieces you, influencer, can work with that we have bought off on, or that we have agreed with on the brand, and then we let them really sort of tell their own story. After we sort of sit down and figure out what that looks like, it has all the, all of the FTC stuff. It's got all of the social channels. It's got everything, that, we expect in a program. Then we actually start to research and identify the influencer mix. And this can either be in the TAP platform. externally. Sometimes they do bring in celebrities, and you'll see a case of that in just a minute. And then once we sort of sit down and we agree which influencers make the most sense for a specific campaign, then we engage, brief them, and start the content rolling. And so that's been a really, really great way to sort of look at the whole process, very, very streamlined, albeit. And then, of course, at the end, there's all of the analytics, and TAP just offers unbelievable analytics for whatever you could possibly want to uncover. One of the campaigns, and I was going to do several, but this is a pretty large multi-pronged campaign, so I decided I'd spend a little bit more time with it. Through social listening and working with the GLAD social teams, we realized, and I guarantee most of the people that are on the phone probably did this themselves, that when people go to give donations, they typically collect it in a trash bag. And so we noticed this as a common theme that was popping up on social, and we were like, hey, that would be a really, really great way to insert GLAD into a very relevant ongoing trend. And that's where the idea of GLAD to Give came about. Really inserting the brand into a lot of behavior that's already happening and really sort of amping that up. There were multiple stages to this. The first one is, Katie Holmes is very well known for her, not only her celebrity status, but also her, interest in philanthropic organizations and causes. And so we got her sort of as our kickoff. And granted, most brands probably can't afford a Katie Holmes. We realize that, but in this case, we wanted to have something that would really, from a traditional media perspective, get us sort of out of the gate, get us on the Today Show, get her talking about this awareness, so then we can sort of move into our additional phases. The additional phases includes hiring multiple rounds of different influencers, both in TAP and then some also outside, where they could go through, take a specifically made yellow GLAD trash bag and talk about going through the process of cleaning out their closets, taking one item out of their home a day for 31 days and donating it to charity, and really going around this sort of social good idea, which was also interesting to media. So not only did we have sort of our influencer campaign, we had traditional media that were covering this as a trend. And then it was something that, the brand loved it so much that we realized this was something that we could do as an evergreen year-long campaign, because people go through spring cleaning and then they clean, summertime and back to school. And so it just had a lot of legs that we could work around, and was a really successful campaign. One second. Oops. Again, some of the activities involved really getting in with these heavy lifting influencers, could do video, could do long form blog content that would sort of explain the importance of, going in and cleaning out your closet and really putting those items thoughtfully to good use by giving away. And of course, we did all of this with GLAD right at the center of it, because it was the vehicle that really helped them collect their donations. Emily Anderson was another one that we brought in. She was sort of another one of our little kickoffs. She drove a sweepstakes and introduced the yellow bag. She was really focused on home decor, so we had people come in and talk about, okay, it's fashion. Let's talk about cleaning out your closet. It's home decor. Is it time for a refresh? And really introduce those things that you could actually, focus on giving away to charity. And so that was a really, really helpful element, because it let us cross a bunch of different verticals. Snapshot, again, we had some great following. The content was amplified by Habitat for Humanity, which was one of the partner groups that we worked with. And then we did a bunch of additional sweepstakes and mat releases and Periscope amplification and projects related to this as well. So very much a multi-pronged approach. I think the brand loved it because it did allow a product that is a little bit hard to pitch on the PR side to give it really new legs and inject a human interest angle that then, people really can sort of jump on, and it was a great campaign. So I think that, there's a couple more highlights. Again, there was tons of great visual content. Traditionally, Glad bags are a really dark, sort of grayish black color. We wanted to give this a visual pop, so we had the brand create some specific ones that were yellow because it played so well to Instagram and YouTube and things of that nature. So again, it was all of these little bitty elements that really sort of made the program stand out, from just a traditional one. So ran through that super fast, but really wanted to leave some time open for some Q&A. So I think it looks like we've got quite a few. Brian, do you want to just jump in and sort of lead Q&A and pull me in when you want?
Sure. I think just to continue on your thoughts, because those were some really good examples. One of the questions that's here I want to just throw out to you first, which is, what are you finding in each of those case studies are the elements of which contribute to the success factors for effective influencer marketing?
It's a great question. I think the one that I keep going back to that is the true differentiator is this is not an ad. You have to get out of this as thinking of it as an ad. You can have things that you want to get across as a brand, but you have to give the influencers and the content creators the sort of the room to breathe and the room to put their own stamp on it. And that's where time and time again, there is a point, and we have brands that are, that will just really want to over control things, and that's typically where you start to get into trouble. And I think the idea of doing the drafts is also that we don't suggest that very often. Again, I think it scrubs the content of the humanity, and that's the part that's so important.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I'm going to ask a question. I'll take the first crack at it, but I'd love for you to bring sort of the practical element to it, which is if we aren't meant to measure by numbers but by impact, how do we measure this impact? If KPIs are vanity metrics, by what indicators should we know a campaign was successful? So this is really sort of the essence of what I'll call just influencer marketing 2.0, which is just adding that moniker at the end is because it means it's a different type of marketing. So in that one slide, I don't know if this question came in before the slide where I said, fill in the blanks. What do you want to do? I want to inspire something. I want to sell something. I want to change something. I tend to look at the state of any market before I experiment, right? Like, if you think about it, I also have to market my work. It does me no good to spend 3 years on a book or a year on a research report if nobody reads it. So in that work, I capture the state of the conversation. I capture my position in the state of that conversation, and I ultimately define where I want to go. I want to change the dynamics of the conversation. I want to be one of the thought leaders of that conversation. I want to move it in this direction, and I want to also have longer-term impact of which then shifts behavior or an impression of a particular topic in this final end state, right? So I look at short and long-term types of outcomes and then sort of reverse engineer, well, how do I measure what those look like, and then more so, how do I design the marketing strategies or the content strategies and the influencer strategies that I start to move in those directions, and then how do each one of those programs contribute to the ultimate KPIs and outcomes that I'm measuring. So not to get all complex, but I start backwards, and I look ultimately at what type of real impact I could have, because it changes the dynamic or it changes the nature of the type of marketing I will do and who I work with. There are a couple of things. If you go to thinkwithgoogle.com, a couple of articles there, scroll down to anything related to growth metrics. And it sort of teaches you this way of thinking, of which then influencer marketing could apply to that. So, Clint, I'll sort of turn it over to you on how you would attack that question.
Yeah, it's so tough. And again, it's to be honest, it's something we dealt with on the PR side from the beginning, and no one figured it out on the PR side either. And so I know that we typically default to things like reach and impressions and brand lift in some cases where we have a call to action that's very specific. But it's one of those things that I think every client has a different measurement of success. And so as long as you can sit down and talk about what that would be ahead of time, it gives you an endpoint. And I'm trying to think of very specifically one that would be a good build on that. We go back to the fact that the content really needs to be useful. And, just throwing products blindly into someone's hands and hoping that they're going to do a good job to explain why anyone in the world would want it, for instance, my dad in Oklahoma, doesn't cut it. Like, you really need to sit down and think about sort of these evergreen, all the things that we think about on the PR side. So this is an eye drop brand. Well, hey, it's summertime and people are outside a lot more and it's dry and there's bonfires, and you have to sort of figure out what the sort of strategic tie-in is for the content. And I think that's really where brands say, oh, this is actually really great. Like, this is useful. It puts natural benefits, sometimes that we didn't even think of, front and center. And then, of course, the social teams love that because then they can amplify that out as own content. So that's a super long way to answer that. I think, again, everyone is different. We love to sit down and have a very strategic, consultative back and forth with the client to really sort of see what their level of understanding is, number one, but then number two, like how open they are to sort of inserting in the human interest angle, which is what seems to be the big driver.
Clinton, a lot of these questions are very practical. And so I'm going to throw a couple at you because there are themes here of what people are asking. So I think I can knock out several questions. How do you suggest determining a fair pricing model for both influencer and brand?
It's really tough. It's one of the things for sure that keeps me up at night. I think, like I mentioned earlier, you get a really, really great content creator or influencer, and they understand their value, and by nature, their numbers go up. So I think we're learning as we go. I think TAP has been a really great partner because there is a transparency there as we go into the platform. We can budget based on the money that we, have at our disposal from the client and make some really smart strategic recommendations. I think it's going to continue to evolve. I think one of the things that really keeps me up at night is that, people typically put a price on their blog content, but now they're really starting to separate all the different channels. And so, I've got an Instagram price, or I've got a YouTube price, or and so that, I worry sometimes that might sort of start to price people out. I think at some point there's a value to the brand, and you can actually extend that you can overextend that if you try to charge too much money. I think we highly recommend against, basically just giving product for people to write about it, because I just don't think that the onus and the quality is there.
I'm going to ask, I think there's just time for one more question, but it's a good one. How do you convince first-time influencer clients to buy into it consistently? Many people expect major sales lift from one campaign and are disappointed when it doesn't happen. This sort of gets to the conversation about having, growth metrics in place that drives different types of strategies. But, how would you address that? And how would you get first-time influencer clients to see things differently besides just a sales lift?
So yeah, that's one of my other big challenges here, is really trying to introduce that. Again, we have a core group of clients that we do PR work for, and now we're able to go out with a completely different offering, which was very much by design. It's a lot of education. It's a lot of case studies. It's a lot of sitting down and discussing, brand challenges and things that, there are a lot of brands out there that maybe have a product that traditional media just don't cover, whether it's a widget or, something. And so this is a really good way to start having the discussion about, well, maybe you look at putting some of your money, you would put traditionally towards earned media, towards paid media, but let's do it in a way that again, it seems more user-friendly and offers a value to a larger group. there's not one size fits all. I mean, I'm hoping with every little webinar and thought leadership exercise like this, people are going to learn more and more. But every time I sit down, there's always a baseline understanding, and there's always like questions that I haven't even thought of. And so I think, again, we're dealing with 1,000,001 different business sort of goals and objectives, and it really just takes you sitting down and talking through those just like you would if it was a media strategy.
Well, Clint, I think that was the last question we had time for, and I'm really happy to see that a lot of these questions were practical, so that they can take these new ideologies, this new sort of inspiration to bring us into Influencer Marketing 2.0 out into the market. I think I don't know if Todd, if you want to take us out, but Clint, I just want to say before Todd comes on is thanks for spending time with us and sharing your insights.
Thank you, Brian. Appreciate everything.
Yes, and thank you to both Brian and Clint. And can you guys each let us know, I'll start with Brian, where can people find you if they want to follow up directly to maybe some of your social handles, Brian?
Yeah, so I think I made it easy for everybody. I'm Brian Solis on pretty much every platform, from Snapchat to Instagram to Twitter to Facebook, LinkedIn, you name it. And if you have something that's a little bit more specific, I'll tell you, if it's practical related, you'll definitely want to get to Clint. If it's just high level stuff, go to Brian, BRIAN at altimetergroup.com.
I'm sort of the same. I think that's one of the benefits of having talked about this stuff and been immersed in it for 10 years is you typically get your handles as they are. So most of mine are just at Clint Bagley, whether it's Twitter or Facebook. Email is cbagley@talktocurrent.com. That's another really good resource.
Excellent. And you can find us via email there at info@tapinfluence, and also just Tap Influence across the social platforms. So, again, guys, thank you so much for this information today. I know we had a lot more questions that we didn't have time to get to, but we're going to do our best to see about how we can get those answered here after we're done with this webcast and get some of those answers back out to you. So, everyone, thank you, and have a wonderful afternoon.
Great. Thanks, guys.